There we go. The American recording in progress. So yeah, I hope you've all managed to grab a cuppa, because now I would like to introduce you to Ian Walters from Welsh Government, who will be giving you the latest update on the recent review of the regulatory framework, who I expect some of our audience who would have already been involved in actually. We will also have an update on from Dr. Bob Smith from the Regulatory Board for Wales, also known as RBW. Dr. Bob will give an update on the report, The Right Stuff, Hearing the Tenant's Voice. So welcome both, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. And perhaps if I kick off, can I begin by thanking you for inviting Ian and I to speak at the conference, and to thank you and the conference organisers for facilitating our shift from the programme yesterday afternoon to this morning. I think it's almost 2 years since Ian and I spoke in 2 workshops at the 2019 TPAS annual conference, live in Hotel Metropole in Clendrindod, Wales, and over 2 years since we launched the RBW's thematic report, The Right Stuff, Hearing the Tenant's Voice, which we launched at your awards event in Cardiff in the summer of 2019. So 2 years, and what a 2 years I guess it's been for everyone. As part of our role, the Regulatory Board for Wales wanted at that time to assess what housing associations were doing, particularly in terms of performance standards 2, that tenants should be effectively involved in strategic decision making and shaping service standards in appropriate ways. So that was a sort of starting point. Though I think the work that the RBW did in 2019 on Hearing the Tenant's Voice links back to our previous thematic report on governance, because clearly we see effective tenant involvement as part of good governance, and so that's been important to us. I don't know, Elizabeth, whether you're able to share the slides. Yep, so that's our title and our affiliations. I'm going to do the first few slides and then I'll hand over to Ian. So if you're able to go on to the next slide. Yep, as I say, what we'll cover today is I'll just do a sort of a refresh of The Right Stuff and talk a little bit about that report and how that has fed into the review of the regulatory standards and the regulatory framework. And then I'll hand over to Ian for the second and third parts of our presentation. And then so we'll take questions, which hopefully participants are putting in the Q&A box. We'll take those questions towards the end of the session. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, as I say, the starting point for our 2019 thematic review was Performance Standard 2, as it currently is, the effective and appropriate tenant involvement and the high quality delivery of improving services. Again, to remind people who are not familiar with the report, we did some initial scoping work in 2018 and early 2019 to agree what the focus of the work should be. And then we set up an advisory group, which included representatives from TPAS, myself and Kevin Lawrence from the Regulatory Board, and another tenant as well. And we took a range of evidence through the advisory board. We also commissioned 2 pieces of independent research, one by Tamsin Sterling, who many of you will know, I guess, who did a sort of desk-based review of the latest thinking across the UK on tenant involvement, And then a second piece of work done by Housing Quality Network, which did involve workshops in North and South Wales with tenants and officers from housing associations to sort of support that that research. We then developed a tool for developing tenant involvement, primarily in housing associations, though we think it applies across the social housing sector more generally. And then we highlighted some opportunities for housing associations, for ourselves as a regulatory board, for the regulator and Welsh Government. If I can just go on to the next slide, which I hope is just the model that we produced. So it's not particularly earth-shattering or innovative, but hopefully it does provide a framework for trying to better understand and develop tenant involvement. So if you look at the 5 segments and you look at the outer rim of the circle, we've argued in the report that it's about having the right mix of people and skills involved in tenant involvement. It's about doing the right things. It's about doing those things in the right way, which sort of reflects upon issues around language and behaviours. It's doing it for the right reasons, recognising what you're trying to achieve in terms of benefits and what are the desired outcomes. And it's doing it at the right time, though tenant involvement is a sort of ongoing process. So just wanted to remind you of that. And obviously, within each of the segments, we've developed each of those 5 themes in a little bit more detail. We can go on to the next slide. Again, I think one of the things that we learned from doing the strategic review was the importance of language. So language does matter, and I think it was brought home to us as a board that tenant involvement, tenant engagement is a contested area. We had long debates as whether we should be referring to tenants or to residents or to customers, and we arrived, I think, at a consensus that tenants was the most appropriate term to use. Likewise, whether we're talking about involvement or engagement or participation. So we have to recognise that sometimes there are differences in language used, and sometimes the language means different things to different people. I think the other thing we wanted to reinforce from the review that we did was the need for landlords and tenants, I think, both to listen and learn from each other. Tenant involvement, tenant engagement is not a process that's done to people. It's an interactive process. And that there also need to be sort of actions that follow on from that involvement and engagement, and feedback to tenants on what actions have been taken and are being taken. And I say a lot of that does come down to the culture of organisations, the trust that's developed in relationships, and a high degree of mutual respect, I think, between officers and tenants. We can move on. As I say, we identified at the end of the report, and the report is still available on the Welsh Government website under housing regulation. So we identified a number of opportunities for housing associations, for the sector more broadly, but particularly, I think, for ourselves as the regulatory board and for the housing regulator. And I've just highlighted 4 key ones there. So we see over time the development of more effective methods of including tenants for ourselves when we report to the Minister, as we do each year, on the performance of the sector and the housing regulator. And although the last 2 years haven't been easy in many respects for sort of developing that joint working, we've continued to work closely with TPAS Cymru. We've benefited from having the inputs from David Lloyd and Bill Hunt in particular through the Regulatory Advisory Group. We've continued to enjoy the benefits of the work of TPAS Cymru, particularly through Tenant Pulse. And we did set in place the Making It Work group to enable the board, the regulator and TPAS Cymru to sort of develop those links, though probably given the difficulties of the last 2 years, we haven't achieved as much as we perhaps might have hoped to have done at the time we initially launched the report. Secondly, we obviously wanted to look at whether Performance Standard 2 did require strengthening in relation to tenant involvement and service quality. And at the time we wrote the report, we raised the question as to whether there was a need for a separate judgment. So at the moment we have a governance judgment and a financial judgment, and we raised the question as whether there should be a third judgment around housing services and tenant involvement. And clearly the thinking was that when the regulatory framework would be reviewed, then we wanted to make sure that there was a better understanding of the effectiveness of Performance Standard 2 in terms of developing that sort of better understanding of the voices of tenants. As I say, at the time, I think we wrote the report, we anticipated that the regulatory framework review would be completed in 2020. Again, for various reasons, not least the COVID-19 pandemic, it has taken longer to conduct the review than we'd anticipated. And obviously we also wanted to be assured that that the right stuff was being used by housing associations in developing their approach to tenant involvement. And again, that continues to inform our thinking as a board. If we can move on, Elizabeth, to the next slide, and I think at that point I'll pass on to Ian Walters.
Thanks, Bob. Morning, everyone. Thanks for accommodating the change of slot, which was something to do with me, but we greatly appreciate it, and good to be back talking at the conference. I'm going to cover the regulatory standards, the consultation, and then talk a little bit about the framework and about the plan for regulation moving forward. So I'll start just by looking at the regulatory standards themselves. What are they? As a reminder for people, the regulatory standards are standards set by the Welsh ministers, which every association has to comply with, and importantly, it has to be able to evidence that it complies with the standards. The standards are designed, therefore, to set out the outcomes that ministers want to see associations deliver. That's not every kind of micro outcome, that's kind of the big strategic outcomes, the big kind of material business outcomes that the ministers want to see. Very importantly, the standards don't tell landlords how to achieve the outcomes. That's something for the board, staff, and so on to decide, and hopefully working with tenants where appropriate in deciding how to achieve the outcomes. Why have we updated them? For a couple of reasons, really. We always want to improve regulation. Things don't stay the same, and we need to make sure the standards reflect what social landlords should be about in 2021 and beyond as compared to 2017. Thinking about current and new risks and the latest regulation practice. So, for example, the pandemic's changed the way things work, and we have to make sure that the framework accommodates different ways of working, different priorities for organisations. But more importantly, though, as Bob said just now, we committed to reviewing the framework in 2020. And in part, that was to consider the issues and questions raised in hearing the tenant's voice. And again, as Bob said, the pandemic delayed the review, but it did kick off in December last year with a survey and then some workshops in 2021, including one hosted by TPAS for tenants specifically. And I think that early work gave partners a real opportunity to shape and influence the ideas to revise the old standards, or the current standards as they are now, actually, but what hopefully will become the old standards. I won't go into detail about the review process. I talked about that a lot over the last few months. You've probably heard lots of it before. but it's just worth reminding people that it was an independent but collaborative review with a focus to improve the system, not start again. Early feedback told us that generally the framework was working okay, so the review focus was on proposed changes to the regulatory judgment dimensions, governance, including services and financial viability, the scope and clarity of the performance standards, particularly PS2, the tenant-related standard, again, which we've talked about before, and then the regulator's role in setting expectations about equality, diversity, and inclusion. So from the survey and the workshops, we had a very clear steer on where the improvements needed to be. And we felt that the standards could be even more outcomes based. There was some duplication which could be sorted. And we need to be very clear what the standards, what the outcomes we're asking for. In summary then, the revisions we made and consulted on were about those things, being as the standards being as far as possible much more outcome based, much clearer, removing some of the duplication. There were some areas of standards that you could look at in kind of what were the old performance standards, PS1 or PS4, you know, they crossed, if you like, and we've tried to remove that. We've introduced a stronger, more specific reference to equality, diversity, and inclusion. And also, and rightly in my opinion, we've proposed a much greater emphasis on tenants and tenant-related aspects. And I think lots of people will know that the environment, the kind of, you know, the circumstances have changed. We've had the Grenfell tragedy, we've had the inquiry, we've heard terms like institutional indifference, we've heard terms like tenants just not being listened to. And I think it's right that the standards that we're going to adopt, or we're going to recommend to the Minister to adopt, recognise some of those issues, if you like. Can we go on to the next slide? So what did the consultation tell us? We had 14 formal responses from a range of stakeholders, including TPAS and one of the tenants groups following the workshops. And firstly, in response to the 5 consultation questions themselves, they were overwhelmingly positive, which gave us a really, really strong evidence base to move forward with the standards that we had proposed. But where it got more interesting, I think, was when we analysed all of the additional comments people gave in support of their yes/no answers. Those comments were generally positive, and although there were a small number of themes which emerged, there was a little overall consistency. So we worked with Campbell Tickell, who were the independent kind of overseers of the review, and we made some changes where suggestions added clarity or context to a standard, and where themes did emerge, they mainly related to positive strengthening of the standards, and we've tried to reflect those. So as an example, in RS1, we had RSLs need to set measurable commitments in relation to equality, diversity, and inclusion. And that has been changed to say that RSLs must set and deliver measurable evidence-based commitments in relation to equality, diversity, and inclusion. So you can see we strengthened kind of that standard, and I'll come on to more detail in a minute. As ever with a consultation, not all suggestions were included, but all of them were looked at and thought about. Some of the comments weren't perhaps completely connected to the consultation issues themselves, but they were still relevant. So we've taken those into account in other documentation, other associated papers and so on, such as the new framework document itself. We've also taken on board some of the comments about the terms and language we use, excuse me, and we're looking at how we can respond to those challenges in the best possible way. Can we look at the next slide, please? So what's new? Following the consultation, we are still proposing 9 regulatory standards. We consulted on 9. We're still proposing 9 standards which cover governance, services, and financial viability. Because of time, and time is really pushing on, what I'm going to do today is focus on the changes we've made to strengthen the tenant-related standards because of what people told us during the consultation. So looking at RS1, for example, if you look at the underlined words on the sides, you can see the first version of this standard read encourages tenants to implement strategic making, but we've changed that to enables and supports because it's much, much stronger and a more direct statement. And that was a theme taken from the consultation responses. If we move on to the next slide, again, looking now at regulatory standards 3, high quality service, you can see that we've added makes landlord performance information available to tenants. Again, a suggestion which adds clarity to the outcome, linking directly to the high levels of satisfaction, which again is one of the outcomes that we're looking for. You can see it C there. So we aren't telling associations what performance information that they should make available. That's something they need to decide, working with tenants. But you know, it's definitely an outcome. People should know how their landlord is performing. On the next slide, RS4 has a few important changes, I think. Firstly, following on from RS1, which we looked at just now, the theme of empower and support has been added. So RS4 is tenants are empowered and supported to influence the design and delivery of services. And I'm sure some of you who looked at the consultation version will have noticed that in ways that are appropriate has been removed. Again, that was a suggestion from several respondees to the consultation exercise. Another change that we've made reflects powerful feedback which told us that for an RSL to genuinely enable tenants to understand the organisation's approach to tenant involvement, it needs to create the right organisational culture. So we added the line, creates a culture which values and promotes tenant involvement. I think that's really important. And we also added an expectation that associations learn from complaints. I think the standards are very challenging for associations, so it's probably worth, if I can, just spending a few minutes talking about how we're going to assess regulatory performance as we move into 2022. So go on to the next slide, and again, conscious of time, so I'm pushing on a little bit, if that's okay. So as well as the standards, we're also updating the regulatory framework itself. The framework is the document where we set out the kind of the whys and hows of regulation, how we do our job. We need to update it to reflect the revised standards and the changes in regulatory practice. And that includes our move towards a new regulatory assessment model, which I'll mention again later. I've talked about before, but I'll mention again later. The principles, though, and the overall approach that we take are the same as the current framework model, in that all associations must be well governed, delivering high quality homes and services and are financially viable and resilient. And the key regulation principles also stay. So regulation will be risk-based and proportionate. Co-regulation and no surprises is one of the fundamental principles. We will carry on with the regulated self-assurance model, which means that the board of each RSL is responsible for the effective management and governance of the association, and for providing assurance to the regulator that it's meeting its responsibilities in those terms. But last and not least, the vital importance of associations hearing the tenant's voice. That's been an underlying principle kind of behind the framework for some time, really. The framework also sets out the main parts or components of regulation, and they are the regulatory standards, self-evaluation, regulatory assessment, regulatory judgments, regulatory oversight and powers. As I said, the framework document explains kind of how we do our job in terms of assessing RSL's regulatory performance. I won't have time to cover all of those today, but just wanted to have a quick look at the judgments in particular. So if we go on to the next slide, people might recall we included the judgment statuses as part of the review. And that's because they're really, really important for all partners. They're the published regulatory view of each association. I think everyone knows, and I certainly would acknowledge, that despite our best intentions, the feedback on our old way of issuing judgments, kind of standard increased intervention and statutory action, was a bit confusing and difficult to interpret. What we ended up with, following the workshops that we did and discussions and reviews of different regulatory approaches, and thanks to an unnamed tenant, the mystery unnamed tenant, we came up with the traffic light system that you can see there and the narrative. So it's very, very clear from here that you know, an organisation is compliant or non-compliant, and then there's a narrative which explains kind of what our regulatory position on each is. The feedback through the consultation was that this is much easier to understand and interpret. To be fair, there were some suggestions for minor changes to the words, but no kind of consensus, no agreement really on what that should be. So we're going to be proposing to the Minister that we move forward with this approach of the green, yellow, amber, red, compliant, non-compliant situation. Just want to talk a little bit about self-evaluation. Self-evaluation is, again, it's not new. It should be a part of every organisation's corporate planning process. I think organisations call it different things, but that doesn't matter. What it is the essential kind of process of understanding and providing assurance that the association is performing against its plans and strategies, so delivering outcomes for tenants and service users, as well as delivering the outcomes set through the regulatory standards. It's there, and therefore, because of that, it becomes a key component of the regulatory assessment. Every association will, as it does now, need to submit to us a self-evaluation at least once a year. Again, we don't tell associations how to do that, but we do say what the self-evaluation needs to cover as a minimum. And importantly, one of the things a self-evaluation needs to cover is to explain how the needs and views of tenants have been understood and considered as part of the self-evaluation. So self-evaluation is a process that needs to involve tenants and service users, and that's really important. Some other changes as well, which mean that there's now no need for a separate compliance statement as there was in the old arrangements, and a responsibility for identifying an improvement plan lies with the association as part of the self-evaluation process. In the past, it's kind of come after the judgment, which is probably the wrong place to go. What we think is it's better for associations themselves to identify where they can make or need to make improvements, and then part of our assessment will be to agree that plan or require changes to the plan in response to what we find. Just going on quickly to the next slide, this is the last one or two now, just talking about the regulatory assessment itself and turning to our regulation work programme over the coming months. So we've been doing a lot at the same time as the regulatory standards and judgments have been reviewed. As I mentioned earlier, we've been working on a whole new assessment model to improve the way we reach judgments. Also, during the pandemic period, we've been working to a temporary regulation system. So we've been issuing interim judgments. We suspended our routine regulatory oversight. And the reason for that was because associations, as well as the rest of us really, were facing very difficult circumstances, and we wanted the focus to be on continuing to deliver services in that environment rather than worrying too much about regulation, although obviously we did keep an oversight, we did carry on issuing interim judgments, and we did keep in touch with all associations. But as I said, we've been working on a new assessment model, and we think it's now kind of time to move on. But getting from where we are now to where we want to be is pretty challenging stuff. Lots of change. So we've drawn up a little plan, and the first element of that is we're not going to jump right into the new assessment model. We think that the team, the regulation team, we think associations, and we think tenants will need time to adapt and adjust to the revised standards and the revised self-evaluations. And so the Minister's agreed it's sensible to have a bridging period which takes us towards the new assessment model. What does that mean? In short, we're going to introduce a programme of what we're calling transitional regulatory reviews, and they will be more robust reviews than the current light touch approach. They will use the new self-assessment process and continuous improvement plan, and we'll take a longer term view of the association's governance arrangements, plans, service delivery and financial viability. And importantly, rather than what we do at the moment, which is interim confirmation judgments, we will be able to start to issue new judgments based on the traffic light judgment system that we just looked at earlier. Then at a point to agree that we'll agree with the sector when conditions are right, we'll implement the new assessment model totally, which is based on every association getting either a RAR, as we call it, a regulatory assurance review, or a full regulatory assurance review each year. a full regulatory assurance review will be a very in-depth review, still risk-based, but very in-depth assessment, which will happen from time to time, with a lighter touch regulatory assurance review in the intervening years. I'm not going to go into too much detail there, apart from time, because we will, that will come out over the coming months. So just finally looking at the timetable, we think that we will introduce the new standards in early January, assuming no bumps along the way, and transition to the transition regulatory review program will commence in January, and we would expect to publish the first judgments under that process by the end of March 2022, if not before. When it's published, the framework document will have much more detail covering the bridging period and the new model. What I would stress is that we'll be providing support as we all work through the changes, and also stress that we'll learn as we go on, as we've done with previous iterations. And if something clearly doesn't work as we expected it to, we'll work with the sector to change it. That's probably it from me. So Bob and I think are ready for some questions and comments. If there aren't any, there's probably some in the box that I can't see already.
Thank you both so much. That was really insightful and in depth, so I really appreciate that. I was just wondering from your presentation, Bob, it mentioned seeking assurance that the right stuff is being used. So we often, as TPAS Cymru, we often speak to landlords about shaping their new strategies and encourage them to use the right stuff as a basis of doing that. Just wondering, how do you actively go out to find out and seek assurance that the right stuff is being used?
Well, I think, as Ian was saying, obviously the last sort of 18 months or so has been an unusual period, and we've moved to these sort of interim judgments. But certainly, we are expecting that regulatory managers will be in their sort of discussions with individual associations, exploring to what extent the model is being used, and that will feed into the proposed new regulatory standards and the framework that will hopefully be introduced next year. So yes, so I think we want to see evidence as part of the sort of regulatory process that that the model and the framework is being used. I say it's not, it's not a model, it's not a simple one size fits all, but I think the principles that underpin that model, we would hope to see they are being used by associations, and associations can evidence that they are being used. I don't know, Ian, whether you want to add anything or correct anything I've said there from a regulatory point of view.
No, I mean, what the only thing I would add really is that when we've been talking and carrying out our regulatory assessments, our regulatory oversight, is lots of organisations told us exactly how they were using the right stuff and how powerful it was as a tool. So we think it's had the desired effect and will continue to do so, and it is driving lots of the thinking about the changes that we've made to the standard have been driven by that whole report.
Thank you. Another question: how will tenants know what the revised standards which their landlords will need to meet are?
Well, the standards will be published, hopefully in the not too distant future. They're published they're published as part of the regulatory framework document that will be available on our website. It will be available on RSL websites, and kind of we will tell TPAS and others that it's published, and it's a public document. So
it's encouraged. Is it encouraged for landlords to share that then with tenants?
Yeah, absolutely. The standards is if you like where the ministers what the ministers expect RSLs to be delivering. The self-evaluation, which is an essential part of that process, as I said, that needs to involve tenants. People need to be aware of what these standards are. So we also said some of the suggestions in the feedback to the consultation were, could we, as the regulation team, do more in terms of awareness? So I've done quite a lot of TPAS sessions as Bob and others, and we're going to continue to do that, actually. Really important. And as I said, and I saw one of the questions in the chat about kind of jargon and all of that sort of stuff, is we are planning, we are looking at how we can publish an easier to read version. You know, some of the words that we have to use are a bit legalistic. Yeah, I get that. So we're looking at how we can publish an easier to read version so that people can.
And I think what we've heard from tenants is that traffic light system does make it a lot easier to understand. So that's great. In terms of that, you know, being focused on outcomes and tenants really needing to be involved, just wondering if the regulators or the regulatory team will talk directly to tenants to get evidence of how landlords are performing and checking if they're meeting standards.
I think it's a really interesting question, and it's a question that's kind of come up an awful lot. And I think the model that we use is called regulated self-assurance. And what we're interested in is that landlords can evidence that they're meeting the standards, so they're listening to their tenants, they're involving their tenants. And there are several ways that we might look to triangulate that. And we're not settled on one particular way of triangulating anything or checking on anything. You know, we check things where we think there's a risk. So if we think the evidence that the landlord's providing is good and kind of provides substantial assurance that they're doing the right stuff, then we're happy. If we think that actually we need to look into it a little bit more, then we'll do that. And that could include various means.
What would a tenant do if they felt that their landlords weren't meeting the standards?
Well, I think that what we would like to see is that they would take that up with their landlords, and they would be part of that self-evaluation process, and they would make their feelings known, and hopefully in that kind of co-regulation, co-regulatory, no surprises route, that landlords would react to that in the right way and deal with that. Obviously, if something, you know, completely was going very, very wrong, and people felt that there's a real problem, there are routes to complain or to whistleblow and those sorts of things.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try and get a couple out of the chat box because, or the Q&A, because otherwise I'm going to ask all my own questions. Does any of this cover local authorities? And if not, what regulations are in place to hold the local authorities to account? From Sandra Llewellyn.
So it's a really good question, and it's something that the Minister and the board have been interested in for quite some time. I say interested in a positive way, not interested in park it and move along. At the moment, the regulatory standards, apart from two, just are for registered social landlords for the housing association sector. The two which apply to local authorities as well are the quality of accommodation, so WHQS2, and the rent standard or the rent policy. We are looking at ways to more closely align kind of local authority standards for accountability for tenant services. Now, we won't be looking at kind of any alignment of governance or of financial viability, because the governance and financial systems are totally different for local authorities and RSLs. But tenant services, the Minister's view is very much that if you're a social landlord's tenant, you should be able to hold your landlord to account. You should be able to scrutinise your landlord's performance and you know, in the same way. And we're just looking at that. We're at the early stages of looking at how that could be achieved at the moment. So it's a live debate, is what I would say.
Thank you.
I can just.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, of course.
If I can just add to that, I mean, as Ian said at the outset, with something that the board has been arguing about, I think, for the last 2 or 3 years. And again, at the start of the pandemic, we asked Welsh Government to commission a small piece of work on the issue of what's, again, in the jargon referred to as domain regulation. I think, again, we agreed that in terms of priorities, that the framework review was sort of the main priority for 2020-2021. But I'm sure the board will want to come back to this issue, notwithstanding, as I say, the progress that has been made in developing some of the standards across the local authority and the housing association sector. But that's not to deny that there aren't some real challenges there. But as Ian said, it is really about trying to get greater equality across the social housing sector.
I think, Bob, if I can just add to that, is last year for the first time we published satisfaction data across local authorities and RSL. We're going to publish again in April 2022, where the data will be much more current and based on exactly the same questions. So there will be some real comparison available there. And I think that's the kind of direction that we're thinking about at the moment. You know,
And that's on the Welsh Government website, is it accessible to anybody?
Yeah.
Okay.
It actually, sorry, I was just going to say it replaces, if people will remember, the clunky old kind of comparison data set that we had that didn't work particularly well. This kind of replaces that in a way, although it's not exactly the same, but it does give some really good insights into relative performance, if you like, or relative satisfaction.
Thank you both so much for your time today. That's been really helpful. I hope it's helped the audience to get a better understanding, and yeah, we'll hope to see you again in the near future.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth.
Thank you both.
Cheers.
Thanks. Bye.
We're now going to introduce our next speaker. Well, we're delighted actually to introduce you to our next speaker, Louise Thompson from our sister organisation TPAS England. And Louise will tell us how tenant engagement in England is adapting as the social housing sector, society and technologies change. Louise will share some of her thoughts and practical ideas for you to take away. So if your volume's not up fully, please do put it up now. So welcome, Louise, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Elizabeth, and thank you for asking me to join you on this conference. I mean, I've just been sort of listening with great interest to the regulatory setup in Wales, and obviously we work closely together across the borders, but it's always good, I think, to just look outside and find